Welcome to Lesson 1.17, Managing Supply Chain Risk. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security and Risk Management domain, and we are in Key Area of Knowledge K, which is Integrate Security Risk Considerations into Acquisition Strategy and Practice. Our topics include supply chain participants, risk and risk management, supply chain assurance, including SSAE 16 reports, CISSP and Web Trust principles, and certification. So let's start with defining the supply chain and our supply chain participants. Traditionally, the supply chain was defined as third-party provided physical assets. These were supplies that were being provided to us so that we could operate and fulfill the mission of the organization. But that definition certainly has expanded and now includes both on-premise and cloud-based physical assets, information, and services. So when you think about a supply chain participant, think about a dependency. So it's an organization that you are depending upon to provide a product or a service so that you can continue to operate. So one of the newer supply chain participants to consider are our cloud service providers. So cloud service providers include our infrastructure of a service, IaaS providers. Those are providers that just provide bare metal basic computing resources. We have our platform as a service, PaaS providers, and they provide computing resources plus operating systems and a database, and the customer is responsible for applications and data. And then we have our software as a service, our SaaS cloud providers, and they provide the computing resources plus the operating systems plus the applications, and generally the customer is only responsible for the data. In a later lesson, we're going to be diving very deep into IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So what are our supply chain risks? Our supply chain risk can include inadequate security by our providers, a disruption so that they can't provide the service that we need, and remember we're dependent upon them to fulfill an organizational mission. We could encounter the risk of aggregation. We could have downstream dependencies. So our supply chain partners may have other supply chain partners that they depend on, and now we've got downstream dependencies. Our supply chain partners may use subcontractors, so even though we feel we're dealing with a particular supply chain partner, in fact there may be subcontractors or those we haven't vetted who they depend on or utilize. And that our supply chain may be working in parts of the world that have conflicting global laws or regulations. So we need to take all of these into consideration, including local customs. We always need to be aware of what the local customs are for our supply chain partners. It's very often now that we would work with organizations that could be located anywhere in the world. So we really have to recognize that their security, their propensity to have a disruption, what dependencies they might have downstream, how they use subcontractors, what laws and regulations that they operate under, and what their local customs are all things that we need to be concerned about and understand, because if they don't match our requirements, in fact, it could impact confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So supply chain risk management means that we need to include our critical supply chain vendors and service providers in the organizational risk management program. We need to communicate clearly to them our expectations. We need to make sure that with all of our supply chain partners, and particularly our critical ones, that we're using clear and consistent language in describing our security requirements and our expectations, and that we are providing baseline security requirements for all products and services, and that we embed our requirements in our contracts and service level agreements. In an earlier lesson, we discussed ensuring that we had information about regulatory requirements and incident response in our contracts, as well as having NDAs and service level agreements. Let's take a look at supply chain assurance. The assurance mechanisms include due diligence, inspection, assessment, and audit reports. Now we're using all of these mechanisms so that we have a level of confidence in regard to our supply chain partners. The most common information technology and security-related independent audit report is an AICPA SSAE 16 SOC report that was formerly known as a SAS 70 report. This is a report that organizations hire independent auditors to perform, and then they distribute the results of that audit to their business partners. There are multiple versions of an SSA 16 and two different types. The three versions of an SSA 16 are a SOC 1, a SOC 2, and a SOC 3, and there are significant differences between all three. SOC 1 is a report of relevant controls within an agreed-upon scope. And what's really key here is that the words within an agreed-upon scope. The audit firm and the contracting organization agree which controls are going to be examined. So it's really up to the contracting organization to say, here's what I want you to look at, here's what I deem are relevant, and they can choose, if they wish, to hide other things that perhaps they don't feel as strong in. So in the SOC 1, the contracting organization says, here's the relevant controls, they agree upon that scope with the audit firm, and those are the controls that are looked at. A SOC 2 is based on the CISSP and Web Trust principles. An organization can choose which categories they want to use, and we'll look at those categories in a minute, but they can't decide which controls they want to use. All the controls in a particular category will be audited. So in this case, they're really following a standard, the standards of the CISSP and Web Trust principles. It's very different, again, than that SOC 1, where the SOC 1, the contracting organization, defines the scope and says, these are the controls I want you to look at. A SOC 3 is similar to a SOC 2, but it doesn't detail the testing performed, and it's really designed for public distribution. And when we say public distribution, we're saying more than just your supply chain partners or anyone you want to do business with, but truly you might put it out on your website for anybody who wants to see it. So a SOC 3 is really thought to be more of a marketing document. There are also two types of SSA 16. Type 1, the audit is based on a limited sample at a specific point in time. So in a Type 1 audit, again, the limited sample says we're going to test those controls perhaps today. It's a specific point of time. Where a Type 2 says the audit is based on an evidence sampling over a period of time. Usually that's a 12-month period, sometimes that's a 6-month. So rather than saying we're going to test your controls at a particular state or a particular point in time right now, we are testing those controls over a period of time to ensure that you have consistently been applying those controls and that those controls have been working throughout that entire period. So the CISSP service principles encompass a combination of the following. Security, that the system is protected against unauthorized access, both physical and logical. Availability, that the system is available for operation and use as committed or agreed. Processing integrity, that the system processing is complete, accurate, timely, and authorized. Confidentiality, that the information designated as confidential is protected as committed or agreed. So when an organization decides to do a SOC 2, they can choose, do they want to do security, availability, processing integrity, or confidentiality, or any combination of those categories. And within each of those categories will be a set of controls that are going to be evaluated. Our Web Trust principles, which is also, there's a Web Trust certification, can fall into the following categories. There's Web Trust online privacy, where the scope of the engagement is based on the online privacy principles and criteria. There's Web Trust consumer protection, and the scope of the engagement is based on the processing integrity and the relevant online privacy principles and criteria. And there's Web Trust for certification authorities, where the scope of the engagement is based on specific principles and related criteria unique to certification authorities. And when we talked about cryptography and public key infrastructure, we'll be talking about who these certification authorities actually are. So let's do a lesson review. We talked about who our supply chain participants are. We briefly discussed supply chain risks and risk management. We discussed the importance of doing supply chain due diligence. Remember, due diligence is the act of investigation. So it's really important that we investigate who our supply chain participants or partners are, and that we have the assurance that they can provide the services in the way that we need, following our security requirements. We looked at the SSA 16 reports. We said that there were three types of SSA 16 reports. There is a SOC 1, a SOC 2, and a SOC 3, and that there were two types. There was a Type 1 and a Type 2. A Type 1 report was done at a point in time. A Type 2 report is done over a period of time. Generally, that's 12 months, or it could be 6 months. And we discussed what the CISSP and Web Trust principles and certification were. Remember that in our SSA 16 reports, we could have a SOC 1, which was based on the controls and categories that are chosen by the contracting organization, or we can do a SOC 2 or SOC 3, where the contracting organization can choose the categories, but they cannot choose the controls. The controls are based on the CISSP and Web Trust principles, and that Web Trust also has a certification process. So that brings us to lesson 1.17, Match the Meaning. There are 5 terms you need to be familiar with, and we're going to be building on these terms in subsequent lessons. The first 3 are different types of supply chain participants in the cloud environment: an IaaS, a PaaS, and an SaaS. And then we have an SSAE SOC 1 and an SSAE SOC 2 report. So go ahead and match the meaning. Put me on pause, come on back, and we'll see how you did. Okay, let's go through lesson 1.17 terms. An IaaS, that's your infrastructure provider, provides bare metal resources. PaaS, platform as a service, provides resources, operating systems, and databases. And our SaaS, our software as a service, is providing the resources, the operating systems, and the applications. Remember, all 3 of these are really relatively new participants in the supply chain. An SSAE report, SOC 1, is an audit process of relevant internal controls. Remember, those are the controls that are chosen by the organization. The SSAE SOC 2 report, it's an audit process based on CISSP or Web Trust principles. And let's wrap up this lesson with looking at 3 CISSP exam tips. Remember, assurance mechanisms include due diligence, inspection, assessments, and audit reports. That we should embed supply chain requirements in our contracts and in our service level agreements, and that the most common technology and security-related independent controls audit report is an SSAE 16. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.